Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi everyone. My name is Chris Buckridge. I work for RIPE NCC. I'm probably familiar to some of you. I've been there for a while. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be with you in Belgrade this week. But I was with Farzaneh, proposed this BoF on sanctions, and I wanted to introduce it and give a little bit of context from the RIPE NCC side before I hand things over to Farzaneh. Sanctions and the impact of sanctions have been a really big issue at recent RIPE meetings, as I'm sure many of you are aware, and even more so an issue and a source of concern and activity for the RIPE NCC between those meetings. We've put a huge amount of work into understanding the applicability of economic sanctions, particularly the EU economic sanctions, to RIPE NCC services. We've put a huge amount of energy and resources into managing our compliance with those sanctions. And we've also put a fair bit of energy into communicating what that means for our members and for their resources. Now, compliance with all of these sanctions is great. It's necessary. You absolutely do not want to be on the wrong side of sanctions. So that's where a huge amount of our resources has gone. But even with the RIPE NCC being fully compliant, absolutely understanding our role, that leaves us with the fact that sanctions of this kind by national authorities applied to a regional internet registry actually undermines the global registry system itself. It undermines the trust that the registry is going to be above political disputes. It incentivizes governments, particularly those governments who are sanctioned, to look at alternative models for registration of internet number resources, presumably more governmental controlled. And it jeopardizes that central authority on who holds what resources that the global registry system is set up to actually provide. So along with all of that energy that's gone into compliance, we've actually had a separate track focused on how do we shift the needle here? How do we actually change the system so that sanctions are not actively undermining a central function of the global internet? So that's a much slower, more deliberative, more collaborative activity. And that's going to take time. And one of the things that we identified as a key element in the first stages was that the impact of sanctions on internet functions is not well understood. So an initial step is to improve that understanding and to document just how the sanctions are doing harm. And that's where Farzaneh comes into the picture. As RIPE NCC, we saw it as a useful step to actually fund an independent academic researcher with background in the issues and the background in this topic to provide an academic assessment of the situation. And that's where Dr. Farzaneh Badiei comes into the picture. She's currently working on this research, and using the outcomes of that research, we at the RIPE NCC and others will look at engaging other stakeholders in ways that could actually convince governments doing sanctions, applying sanctions, to work with us and to find ways to prevent them applying to internet services and or specifically core functions such as the number registry. So the point of this BoF is for Farzaneh to give some updates on where she's at with the research that she's doing, but also, as she'll explain, for you to contribute to the discussion as well. I think hearing from the community on the impact that sanctions are having on what solutions might be necessary or desirable is a really key part of that, and that's what we're here today to do. As I say, I'm unfortunately not able to be with you, but Farzaneh was only last minute able to be there in person, and I think you've got the much better side of the bargain with that, being able to talk to her in person. So with that, I'll hand over to Farzaneh. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So the This is not a research outcome. It's just a progress presentation. So whatever I'm saying here is not finalized. We can change it. We can add to it. And so here it's a feedback session. So I'm going to jot down the agreements and disagreements, and then we can take it further when we are doing the research. And the research timeline is it's gonna continue until next year. So we have plenty of time to discuss, get your feedback, and if you want me to interview you for the research, just let me know. I'm gonna hang out here after the presentation. So let's talk about, what is this? All right. Okay, so first I thought that it would be a good idea to give you a timeline of the sanctions and their impact on the internet. So it is not necessarily number resources only, it's all the function, it's other functions as well. So now this timeline is work in progress, and if there's anything incorrect, you can give me feedback, and there's a QR code. I'm not going to cover all of it because it will take a lot of time. But if you want to, you can scan the QR code and you can have a look and contact me if you have feedback on it. And if you have feedback on, and we can also like discuss it now. I know that the tradition here is that after the presentation, you will provide your feedback, but feel free to just get on the mic whenever you feel like it. So the sanctions have been impacting the internet access in one way or another since like late 90s, and we saw that in the presentation yesterday, how it affected very briefly in 99 Serbia, and then in 2001 there were a lot of US sanctions against, after the 9/11, there were a lot of US sanctions that were put in place, and they came up with this concept of smart sanction, which means that instead of other than sanctioning a whole country, they wanted to be more specific and targeted. So they had in mind this list-based sanction. And so, but then from 2001 to 2009, I have not found data on how sanctions impacted the internet. And that does not mean that it didn't, because we know that for a fact that Iran and other countries like have been impacted by sanctions. So if there is any feedback on this kind of lag, just let me know. So in 2009, there was the Iranian uprising, the Green Movement, and the US government felt the need to support that and saw that's how the Iranians used the internet in order to get their voice heard. So the US government issued a general license. It was limited, but it was specifically for giving access to the internet and to personal communication that is facilitated by the internet. Then we have kind of like this pattern of there's an uprising, and then US sees that what sort of effect its sanctions has on a population, and how important the internet is for a community to get their voice heard. So they keep issuing licenses for the to kind of alleviate some of these sanctions. So it's not like all of it for access to the internet. So then we see like a pattern of more and more sanctions affect the internet, and kind of like increasingly we see the effect, and then there's a direct effect in in 2012, they had to reinsure that internet governance organizations such as the RIRs were not affected and were in compliance with sanctions. And then we have 2019 to 2020 and up to like 2022, we see that there are like sanction regimes that apply to Russia, Iran, Afghanistan, and a bunch of other countries. And we also see that when they issue sanctions, they try to also provide licenses not to impact access to the internet. And by this, I don't mean that everything on the internet, but like certain services that facilitate personal communication. And we saw that the UK also issued a license, and the European Union also had a internet carve out. And the recent Iranian uprising, the US saw that the general license that was issued some years ago was not enough, so they issued another general license. So what does this show us? That's the QR code for the timeline. So sanctions are not new, and they have had implications for the internet since late 90s at least. So the implication for the internet have been increasing the past decade, and from early on, there have been sanction regimes, but also there have been like licenses and exemptions, and all sort of, at least in the US, because they understood the importance of keeping the internet global and interconnected. That's why they came up with these licenses. But then another thing that this might actually illustrate is that these licenses and waivers might not be that effective. Why do we have to like keep issuing them every decade? So that's another, like, it's a hypothetical. It's not adamant. So when we categorize the impact of sanctions on the internet, I have come up with these three categories. So there is the effect on RIR service, and then there's the inequitable access to number resources because of indirect consequences of sanctions, and then impact of sanctions on network operators. So when we talk about the effect on RIR services, we are talking about transferring from one RIR to another. That is a transaction that qualifies as a transaction, and transactions in sanction regimes are like subject to sanction regimes. And then there's the payment systems that banks have to comply, and payments might not happen, and services cannot be provided if payments can take place. Then there's the software providers that provide software to RIRs for, like, for example, dual authentication factors and services like that, that we can see that that they could also be worried about compliance with sanctions, so they do not want to provide their services to entities that have members from these sanctioned countries. And also, RIPE-NCC has been very proactive in telling us what services are affected. And so there's the new membership, assignment, allocation, or transfer requests. So what is this? So that was the first category. So what is the second category, which is the inequitable access to number resources because of indirect consequence? So when the impact of sanction is kind of indirect and entangled with other industries, and then it can happen because the nationals, so they kind of like come up with these blanket sanctions. Compliance is so fierce that they come up with these blanket compliance with sanctions without considering that. So they just don't want to do business with a certain country. And so what happens is that they might not, like people who are not subject to these sanction regimes might not be able to register new IP addresses, and they might not be able to pay. Also, they cannot pay, and also this can give ways to abusing these resources and allowing the small elite class that has alternatives to go ahead and register IP addresses in other ways and be able to kind of like have the upper hand. And banks are not also sometimes willing to facilitate such transactions. And then there is this interesting concept of, interesting is a word, I mean, there is this concept of sanction locked countries. They are not subject to any kind of sanction regime, but they're kind of like surrounded by sanctioned countries like Russia and Iran, and they might be using their IP blocks. And then that could also, when sanctions apply to those countries, that could also hamper their access. And then we have the impact on network operators, which is the broader, it's not in our RIPE NCC or RIR's mandate, but it's the RIPE community that gets impacted because there is an impact on peering and collaboration with ISPs and IXPs. And then also it affects the interconnection and latency to the internet. So basically, what happens is that nobody wants to peer with, and it's not about a matter of wanting, it's a matter of not being able to legally to peer with other with IXPs and ISPs that are in sanctioned countries because they are sanctioned and they might be fined, and compliance is very obscure, and the rules are very obscure. So this is the exciting part. So what are the solutions to this sanction problem, and how can we maintain the global internet while complying with sanctions, but at the same time serving people who, like in Iran or in the uprising now, and they desperately need the internet to connect, and other countries that kind of internet has become an essential service. Anyway, so one way is to have a balanced, transparent compliance process, and so something that RIPE NCC has been doing, that they don't go and do like blanket compliance with sanction and say that, no, we are not going to serve this country. They have an audit mechanism, and they have a very complex compliance system that is also transparent, which allows for people to keep their IP addresses, but also importantly have RIPE NCC in compliance with the law. The other solution that we have been seeing in other spaces as well is obtaining waivers and licenses and exceptions and regulations for access to essential properties of the internet. And I don't know if domain names are essential properties of the internet, but there have been, we were like active in ICANN a few years ago, and well, we recommended that ICANN gets a specific license for domain names, and then later on for like a general license. ICANN has not acted upon that yet, but the discussion is ongoing. And another solution could be convening a cross-industry coalition to facilitate access. And this is about the RIR's kind of like value chain, because they're not alone. They have to like work with others like banks and software providers and other actors in order to provide their services to the members. So what this idea kind of lays out that we need to identify these actors, and we need to see how we can talk to them about being in compliance with the sanction regimes, but at the same time be able to work with and provide this essential service that RIRs are providing. Or we can go to global internet and international fora and talk to the governments and other stakeholders about what are the grounds that we can actually argue that they can be used for alleviating sanction or getting sanction reliefs. It could be like humanitarian ground or other grounds that we can use, and that's the part of the research that I'm going to find out. And also governments could share best practices on when they want to impose sanctions, because we're not here arguing that governments should not sanction other countries. What we are arguing here, I mean, that's my personal opinion here is something else, but here in this research, we are talking about governments like share best practices and not hampering access to number resources when imposing sanctions on other countries. So these are like the solutions, and nothing here is finalized or set, as I said in the beginning. So you can contact me, or we can have a conversation about this, and you know, to add to the solutions, and to also to look at the timeline again, or if you're impacted by a sanction, if you have to comply with it, or if you're impacted because and you can't have access to these resources, then we can discuss it here. I'm going to be here for the rest of the week, or you can email me. So are there any questions?
All right, I guess it's tall enough. Hi, I'm Shane Kerr. Speaking for myself, I find this topic endlessly interesting, so I apologize. I made a list of questions. Are there any RIRs which are not affected by sanction regimes? Because if the world global payment system is affected, and presumably all RIRs charge their members somehow, that's the question, basically.
So I have been in touch with other RIRs, and I have managed to talk to one. At the moment, it seems like we don't know yet the situation. Like, for example, for APNIC, Afghanistan, after the Taliban takeover, they are in sanction list all over the place. So, but we have to kind of like consider that whether the Australian sanction regime affects them or not. So, and at the moment, there seems to be no effect, but we need to monitor the situation. And the other RIRs I have reached out, I'm going to reach out to them, because there's Cuba and Venezuela as well, that they were heavily sanctioned. And then in Africa, we have Sudan. And so we need to kind of look at it. Sometimes it's not like because they have to use a payment mechanism, they are like automatically grappling with the issue. Some of them are not.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess the reason I asked that was because you did mention transferring resources between RIRs. So that could be considered a loophole by people who would consider such things loopholes. But is that a possibility? Maybe even that the RIRs would support as an option?
So transferring resources to another is actually subject to sanctions. So no,
Okay.
they cannot do that.
Okay.
But that's a really good point, actually. So we need to actually document those instances that these transfers could not happen if there has been any, because that would just kind of affect all of the ecosystem. So thank you.
Okay. I will get at the back of the line.
Salam Yamut speaking for herself. So let me understand. So the RIPE NCC position is not to apply any sanctions on number resources, absolutely irrevocably. Let me explain myself. For example, what if there's an ISP that is owned by Taliban himself, right? Or by Putin himself, right? So what we're saying is our position is to try to be exempt from any sanctions that are on number resources.
No. So don't be a troublemaker, Salam. Basically, first of all, what we are doing is research. So I'm not in a position to actually say what RIPE NCC's position is. But what I understand is that we want to comply with the law, but at the same time, try not to preserve the interconnectivity and not to affect the IP addresses registration. So they cannot just simply say, no, it's my opinion that we should not be subjected to this regime. They are, and they will be fined if they are not in compliance, and they will go to jail. So it is a pretty serious thing. But that is not, but as for the RIPE NCC position, I will let them say what the position is.
Jim Reid speaking for myself. Fascinating presentation, and this is a very, very interesting topic. I think really what we're coming to is that this sanctions regime and other kind of penalties that are being imposed on the internet industries for all sorts of governmental reasons are a tricky, tricky problem. And ultimately, I don't think there's an easy way to solve it, because really every RIR, every other internet institution has a locus, it has a head office somewhere, and that's where it can be served with injunctions or be taken to court or whatever it is a government wants to do. So to kind of answer what Shane was before, is are any RIRs able to sort of get around the loopholes or not be subject to legal sanctions? The answer to that is no, because every country has got some kind of jurisdiction over at least one of the RIRs or other internet institutions. Now, the only way to fix that, in my view, would be to have some kind of international organization and be part of an international treaty organization, because then you have digital immunity. Then you have diplomatic immunity. For example, ICAO for the transport, International Maritime Organization, or even the International Telecommunications Union. And in the case of the ITU, we think that would be a really, 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 really bad idea as far as the internet is concerned. So that would be one way to solve the problem, but it would create a whole bunch of other difficult problems, which would probably even make things even worse rather than better. So in my view, in the short term, I think what the RIRs and other parts of the internet infrastructure should be doing is engaging with governments. So going to governmental meetings, I think the right round tables are a good idea. Also, for example, like to say, for example, the NCC going to one or two of these ITU meetings where they can engage with governments who are perhaps not attuned to the current way of thinking about how the internet works. Because my perception is some parts of the world see ICANN or the RIR as being the owners of a big kill switch. And all they need to do is push the lever, and eventually somebody is going to flick that kill switch and turn off the internet in a particular country, or turn off a TLD or whatever. And the reality is that's not how things are going to work. And that information needs to be conveyed to these people so that they can at least have an understanding of, if they feel at the mind that they must do sanctions, these are the things that might work for them. rather than try to have unrealistic expectations of what the RIRs or ICANN or anybody else might be able to do in that space. But I think we have to accept sanctions are a fact of life. We just have to suck it up.
Thank you. That sounds great.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Elena Kushnir. I am the co-founder and director of WebPro company. It is a Ukrainian operator of networks. We are the member of Internet Association of Ukraine. And I haven't any questions, but reflecting on the topic, are sanctions necessary or not? Due to the Russia aggression, Ukrainian fights for its existence military and in the information space. Every day, we deal a huge number of cyber incidents, the DOS attacks on our information resources. Also, the exit from the market of various vendors, telecommunication companies led to disruptions in the supply of telecommunication equipment and software internet connection degradation. It is crucial that sanctions weaken the ability of the aggressor to have advanced technology, telecommunication equipment, and software that are used to attack other countries. For example, in April of this year, as part of the sanction legislation, Germany seized the service of Hydra Market, the largest Russia language platform on the darknet, whose annual turnover exceeded $1 billion. At the same time, the USA government improved sanction of Garantex, which is a platform of Russia hackers to launder stolen money. We, the Ukrainian community, know from our experience how sanctions help to successfully weaken the aggressor and how they help us to survive, fight against propaganda and cyber attacks. We believe that sanctions must be imposed when they help to save human lives. And you must remember that Ukraine today pay by their blood.
Thank you. I am very sympathetic, and I believe that what we are talking about here is just we are focusing only on internet number resources, and we are not talking about like software and other technologies that they can use. That is not the scope of research here. So, but also we need to remember that that sanctions in other industries, they can be totally legitimate. We are not really questioning that either.
But you must know that a lot of IP addresses was stolen from Ukrainian territory to other countries.
Yeah.
We can discuss it. We can discuss it. We can prepare it and give different facts as you need. I can give you my visit card and we can discuss.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, but
because
also
I'm a leader from Ukraine and I know some facts. And in Ukraine, you must know that we have very big community of Ukrainian leaders and internet providers who discuss every day in our channels different our problems. And of course, after our win, of course, we invite you and RIPE members to Ukraine and organize very good conference. And of course, welcome to everybody.
Thank you very much.
So my next and hopefully last question is, what are the thoughts about the actions of the RIPE NCC to preserve number resources to all of its region being considered as a sanctions avoidance and actually weakening the RIR system in general?
so this is about, so the governments themselves have been acknowledging the importance of access to the internet. This is why we have all these licenses that are issued repeatedly after they see how sanctions affect the internet. So the governments that we are subjected to, like Australia and US and Europe, they are sympathetic to the keeping the internet global and providing interconnected access. So this is not an I don't believe it can be like framed as an avoidance, because also we have a very complex compliance mechanism to comply with the law, but at the same time provide the services for like to also mitigate the unintended consequences of sanction, which the governments really like to do. And that is why they come up with smart sanction. And that is why they, every year or so, they try to change it. And this is why you can go and get a specific license from the US government if you want to do certain things that to get permission. So there's no, I don't think this can be framed as avoidance.
Okay, so the idea would be to go to the US government and the British government and the EU government and the Australian government and every government and get an exception? Is that the general approach?
No, well, so yes, it can be. And,
Okay.
But sometimes they have the process in place, sometimes they don't. But also like there's like this higher goal. Chris wants to talk.
Yeah.
I will take my time for now. But there's this higher goal that we go to the policy forums and where they are and talk to them to kind of consider not sanctioning, or when if they want to sanction telecom and internet, then come up with a regulation that is detailed, that has exception in it if you want to be exempted. So this at least in my opinion, the goal of this project is not to just circumvent it. Chris?
Yep, sorry, thanks. And I mean, I think, Farzaneh, you covered most of it there. I mean, I think what we've seen since, particularly in this last year, since the Ukrainian invasion, is first the US came in with, having applied sanctions, came in with an exemption for internet services. The UK followed suit, the EU followed suit. So we are seeing that these governments actually, when they've had a chance to sort of, having with great urgency applied the sanctions, then had a chance to consider, have said, okay, well, actually, hang on, we need to be a little more precise here. I think so that's fine, that's good, that sort of shows that there is that headspace for the governments at least, and that's, I think, a good thing. As you say, there could be a situation where you just, okay, every time sanctions are applied, you go back and you say, hey, fix this, and they fix it. Okay. That doesn't seem like a great solution, and particularly, Farzaneh and I were talking about the timeline the other day. You sort of, there's a bit of a hockey stick thing there, where you did start with sanctions in the 90s and you sort of see them being applied. But if you looked at it over the last 10 years, that sort of occasional thing becomes many, many more sanctions. It's a tool that's been applied with much greater frequency by governments. So if we can work with those governments who, as Farzaneh said, actually have committed to a global internet, have actually said, yeah, we want this to be a multi-stakeholder governance model. If we can work with them to sort of say, okay, you're going to be using sanctions, it seems, but here is a framework or some guidelines or some kind of advice that you can use that will avoid doing this damage to the internet governance system that you support. Maybe that we don't have to take the steps that Jim is talking about there of having a treaty organization to exempt us. We just need the governments who are applying sanctions to see that it's in their interests to craft them a little bit more carefully and precisely.
Thank you.
I have many hats, but right now I'm up here at the microphone as the co-chair of the cooperation working group And one phrase I keep hearing all the time in this discussion is now engaging with governments. So I think you just sort of gave us a focus for our next working group meetings. Farsi, I'm counting you to actually be a keynote speaker for our session in Rotterdam. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Tobias Hübig, also speaking for myself and following up on Jim's point, I think something which policymakers are mostly unaware of and where they are lacking an understanding of how the internet works is what keeps things pinging and what keeps people connected, relying on the internet in their pursuit of freedom and their revolution for freedom. It is the equal dependence of the state on that very infrastructure to keep working that keeps the state from shutting it off, from going to a contained local area network. If we apply sanctions and keep that ability, like that functionality from the state anyway, there's nothing keeping them from shutting down completely. Every little hole will be plugged. And if we want to enable people to connect to the wider internet, that is a balance we have to find a solution for. Because otherwise, we're just giving a good reason to people to step away from the one thing that makes them vulnerable, to leave information out of their country by implying our sanctions.
Oksana Prihodko, European Media Platform. Global internet is an essential value for all of us, but as a representative of a nation is now under threat of digital genocide. I can't imagine global internet without our nation. I am not happy with actual sanctions because they can't protect us from this digital genocide. It's Ukrainian army who protect us now. But I would be very happy to elaborate more precise, more effective sanctions. Thank you.
Hi, Farzaneh, thank you for setting up this BoF. Much appreciated. My name is Remco van Mook. I will choose to do this without any hats on. I have a couple of observations. First of all, if you look at the why of sanctions, I think in probably 95% of the cases that you've put on screen, actually the impact on the internet of those sanctions was not a consideration at any point in deciding on those sanctions. It's collateral damage. It's if governments try to do big politics things, they're like elephants walking backwards. You never know where they're going to end up, and they're going to very likely step on top of you. So what are those sanctions trying to achieve? The sanctions are trying to achieve to exclude people from the global market, countries from the global market access. And in that sense, the internet, as probably the single most globalized product in the world, is of course going to suffer from this. And I don't think that we can even look at access to the internet in isolation anymore, because the internet has become a cog in a far greater machine. It's not about, can I ping something? No, it's about, can I read Wikipedia, right? It's about, can I buy stuff on Amazon? It's about, the ping doesn't matter. And coming from an engineer, that's a lot to say. Now, secondly, and going specifically to sanctions on number of resources, you're trying to sanction the phone book, right? And sanctioning a phone book, what kind of effect does that have really? At best, and I think this is an underappreciated aspect of the whole sanction discussion so far, is the most likely effect of sanctioning the phone book is that the quality of the phone book goes down, because you can no longer look up who owns what. And especially if you're trying to fend off cyber attacks, having had to help different pieces of law enforcement around the planet with pursuing people around the internet, knowing who to call up and talk to find out the next step into tracing someone now is extremely important. So therefore, a functional phone book is very important. Now, finally, and I think this is where the RIPE-NCC is struggling the most right now, still trying to stay away from my hat as an NCC board member, is the biggest problem that we have with sanctions is actually not about number of resources. It's the financial aspect. The financial aspect of us being an organization under Dutch law, therefore bound to implement any sanctions that the EU and then by extension the Dutch government decide to enforce, which we do. And if you actually look at the letter and the impact of what that actually means for the number of resource holders that are impacted is, I'm not going to say minimal, but it doesn't impact the global internet on a daily basis, I would like to think. The thing that really gets us going, the problem that we really have is that out of an abundance of precaution, our banks are not just throwing European or Dutch sanctions at us, they're throwing US compliance with US sanctions against us, for which we, as a Dutch organization, simply cannot get a waiver, which if we had been an American organization, there might have been ways. So I mean, I'm trying to, I'm not answering any questions here. I'm just trying to paint sort of the global landscape in which is playing, I think, some of the aspects that are not always brought up in discussions about sanctions. Where it's not so much about number of resources. It's about excluding people from the global market. And we are relatively powerless to do anything against that. But what I do think is that we need to figure out a way, accepting that as a reality, how do we keep maintaining the phone book with that reality? And I think Chris is now jumping on his chair. So
before I allow Chris to make a comment, I just wanted to say, so there are two solutions on the last slide. One was rethinking the governance structure of the RIRs and corporate governance mechanisms that they have. That could be like one solution that we could discuss. And the other is to look at the value chain and what services we are entangled with when we are providing these services. And maybe those two, we can go into further details about that and see what we can do. Okay, Chris, you can go now.
Thank you. Remco, I think, yeah, you make a lot of good points there. And I think, as you say, the biggest impact is that the phone book itself becomes less reliable. I think, you know, the RIPE-NCC has been very transparent about the actual impact of sanctions on our services. And I mean, if you look at it, the number of LIRs whose accounts have been frozen is actually quite small. We have those quarterly transparency reports on this. What I didn't hear in what you were talking about there in terms of the problems or the challenges created by this is actually the system itself by which, you know, a private sector, multi-stakeholder controlled governance system is allowed to do this registry system. And what we have already seen, and I don't want to overplay this card too much, but because this is what governments do in the ITU, but we've had contributions from governments such as the Russian Federation into ITU discussions saying this is one more example of why the private sector with private sector entities based in specific jurisdictions is not capable of maintaining a global registry system and why we think the ITU should do it. Now, we're still a long way from where they win that argument, but we're not helping us, or that sanctions are applied to us doesn't help us with that argument. We're very lucky, or potentially, that the governments who are applying the sanctions, Dutch, EU, US, believe that that multi-stakeholder governance model should be maintained, and so therefore will hopefully be amenable or open to an argument that says you need to think about this and look at your sanctions regime and how you structure it. But I think that's the much bigger long-term issue for us, beyond the very considerable issues of the global financial system, which you were talking about.
Right, thanks.
Oh, this is very loud. Hi, my name is Urban Schodunlik, speaking for myself. I think this is a very interesting topic, and also awareness about, let's say, sanctioning numbers. I hope that we won't be the people that kill the global internet in the end, because internet is a global project, one of the really worldwide projects, and especially managed in this maybe partially decentralized way. I think it's very important to keep it that way. I wanted to touch like on what are we what are the governments trying to achieve, and like what are what number assets are. Yes, if you look at them as an asset, then yes, if they're stolen, that's very problematic. That was mentioned before. But maybe these numbers are to be distributed. And Internet as a global project gave an incredible opportunity for people for freedom of speech and for communication. And first thing, not giving, let's say, IP space to Iran or something, or just heard. Well, first thing, we have enough NAT and so on to solve those problems, for them to solve those problems technically. But at some point, when this was going to start to affect, it will make easier for the sanctioned countries to, well, make their own isolated internet, start their own, like, reuse IP space of other countries. You know what? We have our own. And maybe in the end, like, I'm thinking IPv4 space is scarce, but maybe with IPv6, we have a lot of numbers. When people ask me about IPv6, I say, why are you stingy on numbers? There's a lot of numbers. And saying that we sanction numbers is maybe absurd just to say it. What's next? Are we gonna revoke barcodes? Phone numbers? Like, well, those are many, those are, yes? For sure. Well, please elaborate on that later. But are we gonna, well, those are mentioned by other organizations that have some immunity in those cases, but are we gonna, for example, Iran, are we gonna take their international phone prefix and give it to another country? Well, nobody would do that, because that would be crazy. And yes, it's protected, but I want to say the absurdity. It's mostly to limit communication, and I think that will put the people in those countries in a worse position to know what's happening elsewhere. And even right now, it will actually, I think, increase, like when you're talking about communication in those countries, it can increase propaganda. If there will be no way to communicate with the outside world, then the local propaganda will be more powerful. And that's true also for Russia. They can still get information from Europe, from the West. It's the same in Iran. I think that's worse at the end for the people, and it has no real effect at the end. It's not specifically a question. If you want to comment, please.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. That's great. So we have, how much time do we have? We don't have that much time. So maybe we can have like, we can go on. Can we go on? What's the rule here? We just continue then. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Max Tuliev speaking from myself. So if we have some people, they think that they are living in Stone Age, and starts the largest war in the world now, and killing people, killing children, bombing cities, now starting to think about use nuclear weapon. So we have to somehow punish him, to let them stop to do it. The sanctions is good idea because it's not a war conflict, it's not army conflict, but it can be used for punish these people. Sanctions now are like stop them using money, like money transfer, money market, stop them use good food, stop them use good cars, stop them use good medicine, and of course stop use internet. So the sanctions, from my point of view, is very good. And why we are afraid to fight with this evil? Just use sanction for full and put them back to the Stone Age. I think yes.
Yeah, that's an idea.
Revoke everything, phone numbers, IP addresses, and so on. So because this is evil and this should be stopped. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike Silver, many hats, but in my personal capacity, and some of the hats will become obvious. So I grew up, was born in and grew up in a country that was subject to sanctions, South Africa at the time. And sanctions do work. I have to accept that. Sanctions work for a number of reasons, one of them being that it reduces the capacity of the military-industrial complex. It makes things more difficult. It makes it more complex to perpetuate wars, repressive regimes, etc. But one of the other impacts is it makes the population aware that they are isolated from the rest of the world and that there are consequences for their actions, for their political decisions, democratic or otherwise, but there are consequences. It also allows for the oppressed to feel that they have an element of support from an international community. So I'm not suggesting that sanctions are not useful. At the same time, the company for which I work operates in a number of jurisdictions which are still subject to sanctions: South Sudan, Zimbabwe. And what I've seen is in many of those countries, add Uganda to the list, Tanzania, the government doesn't like a free and open internet. And the government tends to sanction their own people through internet shutdowns, moderation, and limitation of access to information. So it creates an interesting dichotomy where if you're talking about, on the one hand, a government that's cutting off their population and an international community who's saying we reduce access to information, you almost seem to be feeding in to the government's desires. And so while I'm not suggesting that we should advocate for sanctions to be lifted, when it comes to internet identifiers, I think that we need to educate policymakers around the globe that including internet identifiers in sanctions is a bad idea. And I say this as somebody who's coming from a country whose internet was facilitated, thanks Randy Bush, if you happen to listen to this, was facilitated by a private individual because of sanctions. And Randy, together with the South African internet community at the time, recognized the value of open communication and the freedom of expression that it can bring. Now, yes, it does mean that the local population doesn't have the ability to feel quite the same pain and the consequences of their political decisions. But I think it's worth it in the end of the day to allow additional discourse, to allow information to go through, to avoid the walled gardens. You know, we're in the Balkans now. You know, balkanization of the internet is real. people are very interested in following the great firewall, technical firewall that's been developed, and a lot of African governments are looking at putting their own local firewalls around their country's internet. And the more we impose sanctions, the more we encourage them, using that and others, to actually foster that balkanization. So I think it's a great idea that we start setting some standards and we start arguing that internet technologies, resources, and potentially even hardware and software should be exempted, because I think information is the best way of addressing repression and repressive regimes.
Oh, okay, Chrissy.
Sorry, I'm going to cut in, and sorry to cut into the line here, partly because we've got a couple of questions that have been asked on Meet Echo, which I think we should address, and I think I'm probably the one who's trying to cover it. One I'll read out is from Alexandros Avnon, which is less of a question, but I'll read it out. He says, I would like to mention that the idea of sanctions could be a starting point for building digital concentration camp for bad, based on citizenship, nationality, whatever, up to color. That's a point. But then Monica Emmett had two questions, which I'll ask, one of which is question to the RIPE NCC. How much euro, dollar, ruble are we talking about that RIPE cannot collect at this moment? I don't have a great answer for that. I'm not sure anyone in the room from the NCC will, but we do have the transparency reports online. I don't think those probably address the issues we've had with banks that Remco mentioned. So possibly something to follow up with at the RIPE NCC Services Working Group. And then Monica also mentioned, this is for you, Farzaneh, in the slide, final slide, I think, you also talk about a change of the governance structure at the RIRs. Can you elaborate? I'm going to leave that one to you. So thanks.
Okay. I will respond to the last question after we get the comments, if that's okay. That's good. Okay, cool.
Jim Reid back again to cause more trouble. Speaking as a private citizen, I just want to pick up on a couple of points were made earlier from comments at the line, and the question that Monica just raised about restructuring of the RIRs and other parts of the internet infrastructure to try and minimise the impact of sanctions. In my view, that's ultimately never going to get anywhere, because the RIRs, ICANN, and all these other organisations have to enter into contracts to employ people, to buy equipment, to rent office space, blah, 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 blah. Therefore, they must have a legal identity. That means they have to be registered somewhere and be subject to national law in that country of registration. So no matter how you fiddle around with the Articles of Association or whatever else it is, the bylaws, you're still going to come to that fundamental point. An organisation will have to be registered in a country, and at that point, it's automatically subject to that country's laws. And that includes whatever sanctions regimes that country chooses to implement or apply. There's no way around that. It's just a fact of life. The second thing I wanted to mention was about, Chris made a comment earlier on that we're in the fortunate position that at the moment, the sanctions regimes are coming primarily from the United States. And when the internet community is trying to deal with those issues, certainly for the RIPE region, we're dealing with countries that have got a fairly pragmatic and are supportive of the multi-stakeholder model of how the internet is governed and operates. So I think a thing that would be good for the RIRs and the other organisations to think about in the longer term is what happens if that support doesn't exist anymore? What happens if it breaks down? Then what happens if we're in a situation where we can't call on our friends from friendly cooperative governments because they're no longer friendly or cooperative?
Thank you.
I guess no answer was requested on this one.
I can, well, I will respond to, like at the end of the queue, I will respond to that. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, Dmitro Kokhmanyuk, I'm, well, I guess, speaking in personal capacity, but represent Ukrainian top-level domain registry hostmaster. I'll just heard all these opinions. I don't want to argue with any points I heard, and I just want to mention that it was actually mentioned during the earlier sessions this week. There's the Internet Sanctions Project, which was actually created in response to Ukrainian government letter on sanctioning top-level domains, IP addresses, autonomous system locations, and other resources identifiers. And it was then analyzed and responded. So the sanctions project is at wikisanctions.net. It has a letter itself, and it actually discusses in detail. I'm one of the co-signers of the project. Incidentally, I was also a consultant, well, I guess one of people who co-authored the letter from Ukrainian government to RIPE and CC and ICANN about revocation resources. Well, my help was mostly how to phrase it correctly into concepts of that. I'm not for or against sanctions. It's just like I'm not for or against laws, or I'm not for or against war. I just think that the world we have now has real war, has real death, and IP addresses are just one of the tools of the war. You may think that revoking registrations of IP blocks isn't effective. That's what the sanctions project letter actually said. Or let's say revoking top-level domains isn't effective. But there are other ways to do this. One of them was assumption to publish feeds where you can say, for example, block certain IP blocks, or peering on the BGP level, or other things. Many countries have mandatory domain blocks, and these things are ugly, and operators hate to implement them, and ISPs also don't like to implement them, and operators on BGP level. And Ukraine actually has been legislating or implementing executive level IP peering sanctions. Actually, Maxim Tulev, who just spoke before, his own company was subject to that. I know that story in more detail. So basically, the government says, you're not allowed to peer with those specific IS numbers because they're from the Russian affiliated companies, or likewise Iran. You know, I mean, my country right now is bombed by Iranian drones. Iranian government or people killed people in civilian plane, which was flying, Ukrainians and Iranians too. I have little sympathy to discriminate every or Russian or Iranian person as good or bad. It's not about that. Sanctions are never exact, but just so the warfare that Russia is using against Ukraine isn't exact. When you say they bomb a military object, they just kill civilian people. And you can't say that we must be so nice with our sanctions so we don't harm civilians. We would anyway. The question is how you balance the desire to sanction and the outcome that you have from implementing those in a certain way. If you just try to ignore that, other entities would stop in. And it was very funny. I was speaking to one of the member of parliaments in Ukraine, said, you know what, this RIPE and CC thing, we just tried to get this dissolved. You yank the control from the RIPE and CC, get into the government's hands, because RIPE and CC is useless, just like United Nations. His words, not mine. I don't agree with him. I've been in RIPE community since at least 2009, I think. And I do respect people who are here, and they all have opinions, and that's good. But we can't ignore the problem, just trying to kind of walk around it and talk our way around it and pretend we look the other way. We may look the other way, the problem wouldn't go away. If we don't select certain course of response and action, we just be looked at people who are powerless, selfish, ignorant, and merciless. And you don't want to be in that list. Thank you.
Thank you. So just briefly to respond, we are not really, so the purpose of this research project is to kind of understand what are the ways to comply with sanctions, and we are not talking about any other, as I mentioned, we are not talking about any other we're talking about specifically number of resources. And the uprising in Iran that is going on now, and people getting killed, but they also get their voice heard by using the internet. That very government, which is brutal government, is trying to shut down the internet all the time. And by sanctioning, and unfortunately in these dictatorships, the government is involved in many things. And you cannot, with the mechanism that we have now and with the processes that we have now, proportionally sanctioning them is very hard. So there is no doubt that the ISPs and other like local ISPs might have to like track and do other things to the local people. But those are the things that we need to tackle in other ways, not by taking away and deregistering their IP addresses. And this is just my personal opinion at the moment. So, thank you. Go ahead.
Rüdiger Volk. I used to help install internet in Germany, and in fact, I observed the, well, okay, kind of accidental coincidence in history that essentially global internet with some commercial access happened almost exactly at the time when Berlin Wall fell, and all the other things happened at the end of '89. What I'm seeing is within the community of people who are running the global internet as a communication infrastructure, I think that as a general concept, the idea is around that, well, okay, enabling communication is good. Stepping into disturbing the possibility of communication in general is bad. Looking at manifestations on the political side of doing this, one sees things like the Great Chinese Wall interacting. My take at Iran internet is, well, okay, that is also somewhat controlled and limited and getting shut down once in a while. Another thing, well, okay, other buzzwords that show up on the political side about interfering with free communication here is, well, okay, there are certain parties that want to have an internet kill switch. Really bad idea. Others are saying, oh yes, we should do a sovereign internet. I think that even happened in Brussels. Bad idea. Talking about and establishing sanctions for any specific country is feeding all the guys who are using that kind of buzzword for whatever they want to impose, or that they are already imposing. So I have to say, yes, it is painful to say that, well, we are seeing a country under distress and calls for help. Well, okay, please help us with sanctions. No, that is unfortunately not the way to do it. Kind of, yes, well, okay, if you think that Russia should be punished there, well, okay. Take away still easy ways for communicating with people there that are not feeding the war machine, calling for sanctions and improving of limitations for Iran. Well, okay, that's also, as you pointed out, hurting people that we really do not want to punish and limit. So kind of, yes, the general notion, I think, should be for communication, any action that limits it should be taken very, very careful, and any activity for limiting this in a harsh manner should be completely avoided. Thanks.
So Tobias Siebeck again, speaking for myself, and I think something coming from the previous two speakers, which is quite easily missed. So while a member of Ukrainian parliament, while Ukrainian blood pays for our freedom, thinks of disbanding RIPE, I can assure you, and I've worked with policymakers in Brussels, the thought of disbanding RIPE to get it under state control, that can also creep into the minds of policymakers for something way, 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 way less protectable, like, for example, blocking gambling sites. So these ideas are there in our policymakers in Brussels, and we have to be aware of that.
Thank you.
Hello, Athena Fraguli, Chief Legal Officer of the RIPE NCC. I felt the need to stand up and make a clarification here between this project and our compliance as a RIPE NCC. I would like to assure you that we're fully complying with the current sanctions. We are not trying to circumvent anything. We actually have directions and instructions from the authorities on how we comply, and a reassurance that we're doing the right thing. Everything, the way we comply is described in two LAPS articles, of which I was the author, so you can find them in the RIPE Labs. This project is about how sanctions affect the global internet, not just our service region, but also other countries outside our service region. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would like to talk a bit, just mention, like, not so technically about RIPE NCC, but about freedom of speech, and maybe how internet is connected to that. And first, when it comes to sanctions, I think it's, although it might be like for the same goal, but sanctioning, let's say, internet equipment, I think it's okay. Like, it was made here, shouldn't be more. More internet equipment would definitely help these countries economically, but we want to hurt them. Well, those countries that are sanctioning want to hurt them economically. Okay. When it comes to numbering space, is, well, I think as long as there is one block left, and, well, first thing is internet used by the military or something. I don't think so. I don't think that much. But as long as there's one block left, they have priority, not the people. First is the military, then the rest of the government, and then there are the people. So everything would have to be revoked. But I like to. I've been in Iran. I have some friends there, and I mostly said positive things when I came back and say, but how are you supporting them? And I said what I saw were positive trends. Why are and I'm sorry to go in this in this topics in the international settings where there's also Iranian representatives from that might be of a different opinion, but why are protests right now in Iran? Why? It's because the protests because of the death of Mahsa Amini. It's because Iranian women were able to watch Western media, watch Western content, movies, read articles, see clothes, and they say we want that. We want this, and it doesn't go only for Iranian women. Other parts of Iranian society, I'm thinking now, for example, Iran, but it's true, I think, for the rest of the world. They see that people in other countries have certain rights, and they want that.
So we have to wrap it up, but I just wanted to mention that there's thousands of years of Persian history and human rights that happened in that country now that they're dealing with this. It's not that they learned from the West.
Okay, but still, I think
I think you have a very valid point, and thank you for raising this and getting our voices heard. We need to talk about this.
Then
And yes, the internet is a great.
I'd like to wrap up, so in 1 or 2 sentences, in 20 seconds. So I think that if we take away this, maybe then, of course, Iran has a longer history and so on. But I think that if we take away this, if we do something to stifle freedom of speech, these trends will slow down, and it will not give an opportunity in these countries that we are mentioning for people to know that they might want change, but that's their decision and they should do it.
Absolutely, totally agree. Thank you. So I have to respond to the question about what do we mean by making governance, like changes to the governance structure of regional internet registries. And one point that was raised once was that, why is it regional? Is there like a technical need that they're regional? Is it no, there's no technical need? This is what I've heard. So historically, they just came up with this regional, and then also like the region and what countries they include. They said that they want to like cater to the cultural differences, and well, we see who ripe serves. So we see a lot of cultural differences around. So that idea kind of came up that, well, maybe we shouldn't have regional internet registries. Maybe we should have some other kinds of internet registries that can also, like, because internet has evolved, maybe we should think about how we do things now. Maybe we should change. It's been so many years. I mean, I'm not in support of this idea. I'm just putting it out there. I know I sound enthusiastic about it, but yeah, do you have a comment?
I have been around in certain circles, and as you are asking about that now, I get the idea. The idea of and the license to do regional registries was done before even the RIPE NCC plans were discussed. And the IAB, which was something very different from what we have now as IAB, did an RFC that essentially licensed this. And right now, as you were asking, I got the idea, well, okay, there were pretty wise men involved there. And to some degree, I suspect that one of the leading ideas probably was, well, okay, we have this centralized government sponsored and controlled US administration, and a system change always is a very, very critical thing to do. And well, okay, the wise men of the IAB at that time figured out a way to get the internet administration worked out as an experiment somewhere else, and Europe took it up. And well, okay, so the history created 4 or 5 regions. And yeah, well, okay, there was no technical reason really, but system change, of course, is a really challenging thing. And it was done, I think, pretty well. Another system change probably is even more challenging.
Okay, thank you. All right, everybody, it seems like we are done. Is there? Thank you very much.